The wind howled through the skeletal branches of the trees, whipping up flurries of snow that danced like lost spirits in the night. A thick blanket of white covered the sprawling grounds of the mansion, its iron gates standing tall against the unforgiving winter storm. The house itself was an imposing structure, its grand facade now worn by time and neglect. Victor sat in the back of his chauffeured car, staring out through the frosted window. He had not been here in years, yet something deep within him had compelled him to return tonight. The mansion, once his sanctuary, now felt foreign, like a relic of a life he had long abandoned. The memories were scattered, fragmented pieces of a past he could no longer fully grasp. His fingers tightened around the woolen scarf wrapped around his neck as the car rolled to a stop. "Sir, are you certain you want to do this?" his driver asked, concern evident in his voice. Victor hesitated before nodding. "Yes, I need to." The door creaked open, and a gust of frigid air bit at his face as he stepped out. Snow crunched beneath his polished shoes. His breath formed visible puffs in the air as he adjusted his coat. He had barely taken a few steps when he noticed something unusual, a small figure huddled by the gates, a child. At first, he thought it might be a trick of the swirling snow, but as he moved closer, the boy became clearer. His coat was too thin for the harsh weather, his gloves mismatched, and his boots barely suitable for the icy ground. The child's face was buried against his knees, small shoulders trembling. Victor's brows furrowed. He was too young to be alone out here. "Boy," he called out, his voice rough from disuse. The child flinched but did not look up. Victor took another step forward, lowering his tone. "What are you doing out here? Where are your parents?" The boy finally raised his head, his face pale from the cold, his lips slightly chapped. His wide eyes held something that sent an unsettling chill through Victor. Something more than just sadness. He slowly reached into his pocket, his small hand stiff from the cold. "I was waiting for you," the boy murmured. His voice was barely above a whisper. Victor froze. "What?" The boy extended his hand, revealing an old silver pocket watch. The moment Victor saw it, his breath caught in his throat. It was an elegant timepiece, its once polished surface dulled by time. A faint engraving on the back was still visible, though the years had softened the edges. He knew this watch. The boy's fingers curled around it protectively. "You promised," he said softly. A strange sensation gripped Victor's chest, something between recognition and fear. His mind struggled to place this child, to make sense of his words, but the memories eluded him, locked away behind an impenetrable fog. "Who gave you this?" he asked, his voice hoarse. The boy met his gaze with unwavering certainty. "You did." The words hit Victor like a blow. His knees weakened slightly, and he had to steady himself against the cold metal of the gate. It was impossible. He didn't know this child. He had never seen him before in his life. Had he? His mind was betraying him again, the cruel tricks of age and time leaving gaps where certainty should have been. I don't understand," he admitted, his voice lower now. The boy's expression did not change. There was no hesitation in his posture, no uncertainty in his voice. "I waited, just like you said I should." Victor's throat tightened. The words sounded like a memory just out of reach, something he should have known but didn't. The snow continued to fall around them, heavy and relentless, blanketing everything in a suffocating silence. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You can't stay out here. It's too cold." The boy hesitated for only a moment before nodding. Victor gestured toward the house, and together, they walked through the gates. His driver watched from the car, confusion etched on his face, but he did not question it. As they stepped inside the grand foyer, the warmth from the old heating system enveloped them. The chandeliers above cast a golden glow, reflecting off the marble floors. The place smelled of aged wood and dust, a stark reminder of its long abandonment. The boy removed his tattered gloves, rubbing his hands together to warm them. Victor studied him, searching for something, anything, that would unlock the mystery of who he was. "What's your name?" he asked finally. "Ethan," the boy answered. Victor rolled the name in his mind, hoping it would trigger something, but nothing came. He led Ethan to a chair near the grand fireplace and signaled to his housekeeper, who had returned to tend to the estate in preparation for his visit. She quickly fetched a blanket and a cup of hot cocoa, setting them before the boy with a concerned glance toward Victor. Victor ignored her silent question. Instead, he sat down across from Ethan, elbows resting on his knees. "Tell me, Ethan, who told you to wait for me?" Ethan wrapped his hands around the warm cup, staring into the dark liquid as if searching for the right words. Then, he lifted his gaze, locking eyes with Victor once more. "My father." Victor's heart stilled. A memory, faint and distant, stirred at the edges of his mind. A young man, his face blurred, his voice distant. Laughter, a promise, a decision made long ago. But the details slipped away like sand through his fingers. Ethan took a sip of his cocoa before speaking again. "He told me you wouldn't come, that you didn't care." Victor's stomach twisted, his hands clenched into fists. "Who is your father?" he demanded, his voice quieter now, but laced with something almost fearful. Ethan placed the pocket watch on the table between them. The ticking sound filled the space, rhythmic, unyielding. "You should remember," Ethan said simply. Victor stared at the boy, his mind a battlefield of thoughts that refused to align. The storm outside raged on. Inside, the real storm had only just begun. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows against the grand walls of the mansion's living room. The warmth spread through the space, but it did nothing to thaw the icy tension that had settled between Victor and Ethan. The boy, wrapped in a thick woolen blanket, sat curled up in the large leather armchair, his small hands gripping the warm cup of cocoa. His eyes never left Victor's, unwavering and filled with something the old man couldn't quite place. Was it sadness? Expectation? Victor sat across from him, his mind an endless loop of questions with no answers. He had always prided himself on his sharp memory, on his ability to recall details with precision. Yet here he was, staring at a child who claimed to have waited for him, holding a pocket watch that Victor knew belonged to him, and he couldn't piece together the reason why. Ethan placed the cup on the wooden table between them. "You still don't remember, do you?" Victor exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. "No, I don't." He leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "But I need you to explain to me. Who is your father? How do you know me?" Ethan hesitated. His fingers traced the rim of the cup, his lips pressing together as if weighing how much to say. Finally, he lifted his gaze. "My father never wanted me to come here. He told me it was pointless, that you wouldn't care." Victor's jaw tightened. The weight of those words hit him harder than he expected. He had lived a long life, made his share of mistakes, but the idea that someone, his own blood, believed he was indifferent cut deeper than he cared to admit. Ethan pulled the blanket tighter around himself, his small frame swallowed by the heavy fabric. "But I didn't believe him," he continued, "because I have this." He reached for the pocket watch again, placing it between them on the table. "You gave it to him. A long time ago." Victor picked up the watch with careful hands, turning it over. The inscription was faint, but still readable. His breath caught. He ran his thumb over the delicate engraving, feeling the indentation of the letters beneath his skin. The words were simple but carried a meaning that struck him deep. "Until we meet again." A sharp pain pulsed at the back of his skull, a pressure that made him squeeze his eyes shut for a moment. Fragments of a memory surfaced. A younger man, desperate, his voice tight with emotion. A final moment. A goodbye. Victor's fingers clenched around the watch. His heart pounded as he struggled to grasp the full picture, but his own mind was betraying him. "Your father," he said slowly, his voice rasping. "Who is he?" Ethan stared at him for a long moment before answering. "His name is Daniel." The name sent a jolt through Victor. He flinched as if struck, his breath faltering. Daniel. A name he hadn't spoken in years, one that had been buried deep beneath layers of time and regret. His body tensed, the air in the room suddenly feeling too thick. "My son." The words left his lips before he could stop them. Ethan nodded. "Yes." Victor stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the polished floor. He turned away, pacing toward the grand windows that overlooked the snow-covered grounds. The storm outside had worsened, the wind howling like a wounded beast. His reflection in the glass was ghostly, the once powerful man now looking like a shadow of himself. His son, Daniel. How had things come to this? How had he allowed himself to forget something so important? He braced himself against the windowsill, gripping the cool wood as memories began to surface, breaking through the fog of his mind like cracks in a frozen lake. A heated argument, raised voices, the weight of disappointment. A young man standing before him, fists clenched, his eyes filled with betrayal. "You don't understand, do you? You never did. You never will." And then, Victor couldn't remember the rest. It was like staring at a half-finished puzzle with missing pieces. Behind him, Ethan shifted in his seat, watching him closely. "He never talks about you," the boy said, his voice quieter now. "I think he hates you." Victor swallowed hard. Maybe he has a reason. Ethan didn't respond right away. When he finally spoke, his voice carried something fragile beneath its surface. "Do you regret it?" Victor turned to look at him. The child's expression was sincere, his small hands gripping the edges of the blanket. He wasn't accusing, he was asking. Victor let out a long breath. "I don't know." It was the most honest answer he could give. Silence stretched between them, interrupted only by the crackling of the fire and the distant wailing of the storm. Ethan shifted in his seat. "If you could see him again, what would you say?" Victor hesitated, his throat tightening. He had spent years convincing himself that the past was just that, the past, that there was no going back, no mending what had been broken. But now, faced with the boy who carried his blood and his questions, the reality of it all crashed down on him. "I don't know if there's anything I can say that would change what's already happened," Victor admitted, his voice quieter than before. "But I suppose I'd tell him that I never wanted to forget." Ethan's fingers played with the edge of the blanket. His expression was unreadable. "Then maybe you should tell him." Victor's throat tightened, but before he could respond, the boy yawned, exhaustion settling into his small frame. The tension in the room eased just slightly. "You should rest," Victor said. "We can talk more in the morning." Ethan nodded sleepily. He curled up in the chair, his body sinking into the warmth of the blanket. It wasn't long before his breathing evened out, his chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. Victor remained standing, watching him in silence. The pocket watch sat between them on the table, its ticking steady and unrelenting, marking each second that passed. Victor reached out, closing his hand around it. For the first time in years, he felt something stir within him. A longing, a chance, and maybe, just maybe, a reason to hope. The storm had finally begun to subside, leaving behind a thick, undisturbed layer of snow that blanketed the mansion's vast grounds. The morning light crept through the heavy curtains, casting long golden streaks across the grand living room where the embers of last night's fire still glowed faintly. The house was silent except for the soft ticking of the pocket watch resting on the table between them. Victor had barely slept. He sat in his armchair, his fingers lightly tapping against the wooden armrest as his thoughts churned relentlessly. The revelations from the night before had left him shaken in a way he hadn't felt in years. A son, a grandson, an entire branch of his life he had let wither, forgotten in the depths of his own regret. He glanced toward Ethan, who was still curled up in the chair across from him, wrapped tightly in the wool blanket. His small chest rose and fell in the steady rhythm of sleep, his face peaceful in the dim morning light. Victor exhaled slowly. There was something about the boy, his determination, the unwavering way he had spoken the night before, that reminded him of someone, himself. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. The housekeeper, a woman who had been with the estate for years, stepped in quietly, carrying a tray of breakfast. The scent of warm bread and fresh coffee filled the air. Victor nodded his thanks as she placed the tray down, her gaze lingering on the boy before she turned to him with a hesitant expression. "Is he staying, Mr. Victor?" Victor hesitated. "For now." The woman gave a small nod before retreating back into the kitchen, leaving him alone once more. He reached for the coffee, the warmth seeping into his fingers as he took a slow sip. Ethan stirred then, a small yawn escaping him as he blinked against the morning light. His eyes found Victor almost immediately. "You're still here?" Victor raised a brow. "Where else would I be?" Ethan shrugged, pushing himself upright and rubbing the sleep from his eyes. "I don't know. I just thought—" He trailed off, his fingers grazing the pocket watch still on the table. "Maybe you'd leave before I woke up." Something in Victor's chest tightened. The idea that the boy had expected abandonment spoke volumes about the life he had lived, about what his father had told him. "I don't run away from things, Ethan." The boy gave him a look that was far too wise for his age. "Are you sure about that?" Victor's grip on his coffee cup tightened, but he said nothing. Ethan reached for the bread and tore off a small piece, eating in silence before glancing up at Victor again. "Will you see my dad?" Victor exhaled, leaning back in his chair. "It's not that simple." Ethan frowned. "Why not?" 100 reasons ran through Victor's mind. Pride, fear, the weight of mistakes that could never be undone. He had told himself for years that some wounds could never be healed, that silence was better than facing the past. But now, faced with the boy who carried his blood and his questions, that excuse felt weak. "He doesn't want to see me," Victor finally said. Ethan played with the hem of his blanket, staring at his lap. "Maybe he does. Maybe he just doesn't know how." Victor scoffed lightly. "You're a very stubborn child." Ethan gave a small, lopsided grin. "That's what my dad says too." Silence stretched between them again. Outside, the snow-covered trees stood motionless, their branches heavy with the weight of winter. Victor let his gaze drift toward them, his mind reaching into the past, trying to grasp the missing pieces. "What happened between you and my dad?" Ethan finally asked. Victor's jaw tensed. "I wish I could tell you, but the truth is, I don't remember all of it." Ethan's brows furrowed. "Because you forgot." Victor nodded slowly. "Some memories fade over time. Others, you push away so hard that you convince yourself they never existed." Ethan was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Do you want to remember?" Victor met his gaze. The boy had a way of asking questions that cut through the layers of avoidance, of years spent burying the past. "Yes," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Ethan brightened, sitting up straighter. "Then we should find a way." Victor huffed a quiet laugh. "And how do you propose we do that?" Ethan thought for a moment, before his face lit up with an idea. "Photos." Victor frowned. "Photos?" The boy nodded. "Pictures help people remember things, right? You have to have some from when my dad was young." Victor considered that. There had been albums once, tucked away in some forgotten drawer or packed into the depths of the house's many rooms. He hadn't looked at them in years. Ethan hopped off the chair. "Come on, we can look together." Victor hesitated. The idea of digging through remnants of a past he had tried to forget unnerved him. But then Ethan looked at him, eyes filled with an innocent kind of hope, and he found himself nodding. They searched through the house, the grand corridors echoing with their footsteps. Room after room, they uncovered relics of a life Victor had long since abandoned. Dust-covered books, old letters, forgotten trinkets. And then, in the farthest room of the house, tucked away inside a wooden chest, they found them. Photographs. Victor hesitated before lifting the first one. His hand shook slightly as he brushed away the dust. The image was old, its edges curled with time. A young boy stood in the center of the frame, his dark eyes bright, his smile wide with mischief. Daniel. Victor swallowed hard. The memory hit him like a sharp gust of wind. His son at 5 years old, laughing as he ran through the gardens. Another photo. Daniel at 12, standing stiffly in a suit, his expression serious. And another. Daniel at 16. The last photo Victor could remember. The last time they had spoken before everything fell apart. He sat heavily in the nearest chair, the photo trembling slightly in his grip. Ethan peered over his shoulder. "That's him," he said quietly. Victor ran a hand down his face. "I barely recognize him." Ethan looked at him then, his voice softer. "Maybe he barely recognizes you too." Victor's throat tightened. The photos had done more than just bring back memories. They had brought back regret, an ache so deep that it left him breathless. Ethan reached into the chest again and pulled out one last item, a letter, yellowed with age. He held it out to Victor. "You should read this." Victor stared at the envelope. His name written in ink that had long since faded. His fingers hovered over the edge, his heart hammering in his chest. He took a deep breath and opened it. The past was no longer just a memory. It was here, demanding to be faced. Victor sat frozen, the letter trembling in his hands, the faded ink, the delicate folds of the paper. This was no ordinary letter. It was a relic from a past he had tried to erase. A voice reaching out from a time he had convinced himself was long gone. Ethan watched him carefully, his small hands resting on the wooden chest filled with old photographs. The boy had an unusual stillness about him, as if he understood the gravity of the moment without needing an explanation. Victor inhaled deeply, steadying himself before unfolding the letter. The creases were fragile, the paper brittle with age, but the handwriting was unmistakable. His son's, "Father, I don't know why I'm writing this. Maybe because I need to, even if I never send it, even if you never read it. Maybe it's because, despite everything, I still wish things had been different. You always told me that time heals everything, that people change, that wounds close. But what if some wounds never do? What if time doesn't fix what was broken, but only buries it deeper? I used to hate you. I won't lie. For a long time, I wished I had never known you at all. But hate is exhausting, and after a while, all that was left was silence. Maybe that's worse. I don't know if you ever think about me. I don't know if I'm just another chapter you closed, a mistake you erased. But I think about you. I wonder if you would recognize me now, if you would be proud, if you would regret the choices you made. I don't need an apology. I just wish I understood why you left." Daniel Victor's hands clenched the edges of the letter, his breath catching in his throat. His vision blurred, the weight of each word pressing down on him like a heavy stone. Left. That word echoed in his mind, reverberating through the empty spaces of his memory. He had always believed Daniel had walked away from him, that the distance between them had been a choice made by his son. But this letter suggested something else entirely. A deep sense of unease settled in his chest. Had he been wrong all these years? He closed his eyes, willing his mind to clear, to focus. And then, like the first crack in an old, frozen river, the memories began to surface. A younger version of himself, standing in the grand foyer of this very house, a suitcase at his feet, raised voices, accusations thrown like daggers. Daniel, barely 16, his face contorted with anger, with hurt. "You care more about your business than you ever cared about me." "That's not true." "Then why are you leaving?" Victor's throat tightened. He could hear the desperation in the boy's voice, see the way his hands had curled into fists, how he had fought to keep the tears from falling. And then, silence. A silence so loud it had consumed everything else. The memory shattered, leaving Victor breathless. He had left. He had walked away first. His mind had buried the truth, rewritten history to protect him from the guilt. And now, here he was, face to face with the consequences of his own choices. Ethan shifted beside him. "You remember something, don't you?" Victor nodded, but his voice betrayed him when he tried to speak. Instead, he handed the letter to Ethan, letting him read his father's words for himself. The boy's expression softened as he reached the end. "He wrote this a long time ago." "Yes." Ethan traced his fingers over the ink, thoughtful. "But he never sent it." Victor swallowed. "No." Ethan looked up at him, eyes filled with something that made Victor's chest ache. "Do you think he still feels this way?" Victor didn't have an answer. How could he? He had spent decades pretending the past was a closed book, only to realize now that it had been waiting for him all along. He rubbed his temples, exhaustion creeping into his bones. "I need to see him." Ethan's face lit up with something close to relief, but there was also hesitation. "What if he doesn't want to see you?" Victor let out a slow breath. "Then at least I'll know I tried." The boy studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I'll take you to him." Victor frowned. "You know where he is?" Ethan hesitated. "Sort of." He chewed his lip before explaining. "I don't live with him." "Not all the time." Victor stiffened. "What do you mean?" Ethan looked down at the letter in his hands. "My parents split up a while ago. My mom has me most of the time, but I visit my dad when he lets me." Victor's stomach twisted. He had spent years imagining Daniel as a man who had erased him, who had chosen a life without him. But now, faced with the reality of a son who had struggled with his own demons, who had carried his own burdens, he felt something close to shame. "Where does he live?" Victor asked, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. Ethan hesitated again. "It's not far. I can take you." Victor's pulse quickened. He hadn't seen Daniel in over 20 years. What would he look like? Would he recognize him? Would he even let him in? Doubt crept in, but he pushed it aside. He had spent too long running from the truth. It was time to face it. He stood, folding the letter carefully before tucking it into his coat. "Then let's go." Ethan grinned. "You should change first." Victor glanced down at himself, still dressed in last night's clothes, his shirt wrinkled, his tie loosened. He let out a dry chuckle. "I suppose you're right." Ethan laughed, the first real laugh Victor had heard from him. It was small, but it was something. And as Victor turned toward the stairs, heading to change before the most important meeting of his life, he realized something. For the first time in years, he wasn't afraid of what was waiting for him. He was ready. Victor had changed into a dark wool coat, his movements slow, deliberate. His reflection in the mirror caught his attention, a face lined with age, with regrets carved into every crease. He had lived decades with the belief that time had stolen his past, but now he understood the truth. He had been the one to turn away. Ethan waited by the door, his small hands tucked into his pockets, shifting from foot to foot with restless energy. He had barely eaten, too eager to take his grandfather to the place where everything would come full circle. Victor took a deep breath and stepped into the cold. The sky was a pale gray, the morning sun struggling to pierce through the thick clouds. The snow beneath their boots crunched with every step as they made their way down the long driveway. "Are you sure about this?" Ethan asked, his voice hesitant for the first time. "No," Victor admitted, his breath forming small clouds in the air. "But I have to do it anyway." They reached the car. Victor hesitated before opening the door, gripping the handle as if grounding himself. Then, with a firm nod, he climbed in. The ride was quiet at first, the rhythmic hum of the tires against the road filling the silence. Victor watched as the scenery passed, snow-covered fields, bare trees stretching toward the sky, small houses nestled against the winter landscape. He had spent so many years in the comfort of his own world, surrounded by luxury, but untouched by life. Now, He was heading toward the one thing he had spent years avoiding. "Do you think he'll be angry?" Ethan asked suddenly. Victor exhaled through his nose. "I think he has every right to be." Ethan glanced out the window. "Yeah, I guess so." The drive felt longer than it was, the weight of the moment stretching each passing minute. When the car finally slowed in front of a modest house, Victor's pulse quickened. It wasn't the kind of home he had expected. There was nothing extravagant about it. No sign of the wealth Victor had once assumed Daniel would have sought. It was simple, quiet, lived in. Ethan unbuckled his seatbelt and turned to him. "This is it." Victor swallowed hard. His hands felt cold despite the warmth inside the car. He hadn't seen his son in over 20 years. What would he say? How could he even begin to make amends? "Are you coming?" Ethan asked, already halfway out the door. Victor forced himself to move. His legs felt heavy as he stepped onto the driveway, his breath unsteady. The house loomed ahead, small but imposing in a way that had nothing to do with its size. Ethan walked ahead of him, his step sure. He had been here before. This was familiar to him. Victor was the stranger. They reached the door, and Ethan knocked 3 times. Victor stood slightly behind him, his hands clasped together to keep from fidgeting. A long moment passed. Then, the door opened. Daniel stood there, his expression unreadable. Victor's breath hitched. His son had changed. Gone was the boy he had last seen, the one filled with anger and hurt. The man before him was older now, his features sharper, his eyes tired. There was a weight in his posture, the kind that came from carrying burdens alone for too long. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Daniel's gaze flickered to Ethan. "What are you doing here?" Ethan shifted. "I brought him." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Ethan, go inside." "But, now." Ethan hesitated, looking between them. Then, with a reluctant nod, he slipped past his father and disappeared into the house. The door didn't close. Victor forced himself to meet Daniel's gaze. "Why are you here?" Daniel interrupted, his voice hard. Victor hesitated. He had imagined this moment 100 different ways, but now that it was happening, every word he had rehearsed felt meaningless. "I needed to see you," he finally said. Daniel let out a dry laugh. "Now, after all these years?" Victor swallowed. "I know I failed you." Daniel's expression didn't change. "Failed me?" His voice was quiet, but sharp. "You left me. Do you even remember that?" Victor flinched. "I remember now." Daniel shook his head, stepping back. "You don't get to show up and pretend like that changes anything." Victor took a slow breath. "I don't expect it to." Daniel's fingers curled against the door frame, his knuckles white. "Then why are you here?" Victor looked at him, the son he had lost, the man he had never gotten the chance to know. He saw the pain in his eyes, the walls he had built so carefully over the years. And for the first time in his life, Victor didn't try to justify himself. "I don't have an excuse," he said simply. "I can't change the past. I can't fix what I broke. But I don't want to leave things like this." Daniel stared at him. His jaw clenched. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, Daniel exhaled, stepping aside. "Come in." Victor's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't expected that. He hesitated for only a second before stepping forward. As he crossed the threshold, the weight of the years between them pressed heavy on his shoulders. But for the first time in decades, he felt something he thought he had lost forever. A chance. The air inside Daniel's house was warmer than Victor expected, filled with the faint scent of coffee and something subtly familiar, perhaps the lingering traces of a childhood memory he had long forgotten. He hesitated just past the threshold, feeling like an intruder in his own son's world. Daniel led him into the modest living room, the furniture well-worn but comfortable. A few framed photos lined the shelves, pictures of Ethan, some school portraits, a few candid shots. But none of them held Victor's face. He had no place in this house. No presence in this life. Ethan reappeared, watching them carefully as if afraid either of them might run. He perched himself on the couch, his eyes flickering between his father and grandfather. Daniel crossed his arms, leaning against the armchair opposite Victor. "Say what you came to say." Victor exhaled. "I don't know if there's anything I can say that would make a difference." Daniel scoffed. "That's convenient." Victor nodded, accepting the blow. "I deserve that." Silence settled between them again, thick with unspoken words. Victor glanced at Ethan before looking back at Daniel. "I read your letter." Daniel stiffened, his expression unreadable. Victor hesitated. "I don't know why you never sent it. Maybe you thought it wouldn't matter. Maybe you were right. But it mattered to me." Daniel's jaw clenched, his fingers tightening around his crossed arms. "You asked why I left," Victor continued. "I didn't remember the answer until yesterday. I convinced myself you were the one who walked away. That made it easier to live with. But the truth is, I left first." Daniel's lips pressed into a thin line. "I thought I was doing what was best," Victor admitted. "I thought you'd be better off without me, but I was wrong. And by the time I realized it, too much time had passed. I let my pride and my guilt keep me away. I won't ask you to forgive me, Daniel. I won't insult you by pretending that I deserve it. But I don't want to leave things unfinished." Daniel looked away, his fingers running through his short hair. "You think you can just show up after 20 years and make things right?" Victor shook his head. "No, but I can show up now, and I can keep showing up if you'll let me." Ethan shifted on the couch, watching his father carefully. Daniel let out a slow breath. "Ethan, go to your room." "But now." The boy hesitated, but something in his father's tone made him obey. With one last glance at Victor, he disappeared down the hall. Daniel waited until Ethan's door clicked shut before speaking again, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier anger. "I spent years trying not to care, telling myself you were nothing to me. But when Ethan was born, I hated you even more." Victor swallowed hard. "Because I looked at him and knew I could never do to him what you did to me," Daniel said. "I could never leave. No matter how hard it got, no matter how much I failed, I would always be there." Victor's heart twisted at the words. Daniel's eyes darkened. "So when he started asking about you, I told him the truth, that you weren't part of our lives, that you didn't want to be." Victor's breath hitched. "But he didn't believe me," Daniel muttered, shaking his head. "And no matter what I said, he kept asking. And then one day, he found that damn watch. He took it as proof that you weren't who I said you were." Victor felt his chest tighten. Daniel let out a bitter laugh. "You know what's funny? I spent years trying to forget you, and now, my own son brought you back." Victor's voice was barely above a whisper. "I never stopped thinking about you." Daniel looked away. Victor hesitated before taking a slow step forward. "I know I can't fix what I broke. I know I can't undo the years we lost. But if there's any part of you that still wants to know me, I'll be here." Daniel didn't answer right away. The silence stretched, heavy and uncertain. Then, finally, he let out a quiet breath. "I don't know if I can forgive you." Victor nodded. "That's okay." Daniel's fingers curled into fists before relaxing again. He glanced toward the hallway where Ethan had disappeared. "But he deserves to know you," he admitted. Victor's breath caught. Daniel met his eyes again. Something softer, hesitant but real, lingering in his gaze. "So if you're serious about showing up, start with him." Victor swallowed past the lump in his throat. "I will." Daniel gave a small nod, then turned toward the kitchen. "Stay for dinner." Victor blinked, surprised. Daniel didn't turn back. "It's not an invitation to make things right. It's just a meal. Nothing more." Victor's throat tightened. "Okay." Daniel disappeared into the kitchen, leaving Victor standing in the quiet living room. Ethan peeked out from behind the hallway, his eyes bright with hope. Victor offered him a small smile. Maybe this wasn't a perfect ending. Maybe there would still be resentment, still wounds too deep to heal. But it was a start. And for now, that was enough. Some wounds take time to heal, and some second chances come when we least expect them. What did you think of this emotional journey? Let me know in the comments. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. Your support helps this channel grow and bring you more powerful stories like this one. See you in the next video.